Hello, my name is Laurel Dosman, and this is my presentation on developmental disability and prevalence in Canadian Judiciary institutions. This is a knowledge translation of these four articles. The first article is a article by Crocker and colleague that covers the characteristics of men with an intellectual disability in pretrial detention. This is based out of Quebec. Matheson and colleagues wrote an article on intellectual and developmental disabilities among people incarcerated in federal correctional facilities in Ontario, Canada, examining prevalence, health, and correctional characteristics. Stewart and colleagues looked at offenders with cognitive deficit in a Canadian prison population, prevalence profile and outcomes. And Whittingham and colleagues looked at the prevalence and health status of people with developmental disabilities in provincial prisons in Ontario, Canada, a retrospective cohort study. International data reveals that people with developmental disabilities are overrepresented in prison settings across the world, which may attribute to health and social factors that increase the risk of engaging in maladaptive behaviors and leads to more frequent police contact. The estimated prevalence of developmental disabilities in people in the criminal justice system worldwide ranges from 2% to 40%. This wide range reflects differences in the definition and assessment of developmental disabilities and in the types of criminal justice system settings and differences in the research methodologies used to assess this criteria, which we will also see in the Canadian data. In Ontario, 2.1% of the prison population was diagnosed with a developmental disability before they were in the judiciary system. In relation to the prevalence of individuals with developmental disability in the general population, this is 3 times higher than the general population representation. In the Crocker study, which was done in Quebec, 19% of the prison population was defined as having intellectual disability. And when they expanded the definition to mild and moderate levels of intellectual disability, the percentage actually expanded to almost 30%. In British Columbia and the Yukon, with the Stewart study, 25% of offenders fell under the category of having an intellectual disability. Of the individuals that were assessed with Indigenous descent, 38% fell in the category of having an intellectual or developmental disability. Matheson and Whittingham recognize that there is a difference between the Crocker study and their outcomes of only 2% versus 20%. And so they said that this difference in prevalence may result from the differences in study methods, since Crocker and colleagues systematically assessed study participants through administration of a screening tool, whereas Matheson and Whittingham used administrative data, which likely underestimate the true prevalence of developmental disabilities. The Stewart study used a screening tool upon entry into the prison system called the Cognistat assessment, whereas Whittingham and Matheson used data received from Health Services of Ontario. The Crocker study used a pre-screening tool as well called the Intellectual Ability Scale, and that might be why the Crocker and the Stewart articles have similar outcomes and prevalence rates in comparison to the Ontario or prevalence rates. Across all four articles, there were a few outstanding similarities that we would like to address. The first is longer incarceration times. So over the study period, on average, people with developmental disabilities were incarcerated in provincial prisons for longer periods of time than people without developmental disabilities. In the Whittingham article, not only were they incarcerated for longer periods of time, but they were more likely to have had incarceration before or after their current incarceration period compared to the regular population. They also found that individuals with developmental or intellectual disabilities were more likely to have multiple jail sentences and incur disciplinary charges when they were serving their sentences as well. We also found that individuals with developmental disabilities were typically younger and came from areas of lower socioeconomic status. Out of the incarcerated groups, in the incarcerated groups with developmental disabilities, they were more likely to live in neighborhoods with higher material deprivation quintiles compared to those incarcerated without developmental disabilities and the two non-incarcerated groups, which means our individuals with intellectual or developmental disability are going into the system younger and typically are from lower socioeconomic groups than the regular prison population on average. There was a comorbidity of substance abuse and mental health diagnosis across multiple studies. The prevalence of any mental health disorder diagnosis was higher in people in the prison group with developmental disabilities compared to with people in the general population with developmental disabilities at 79.2% versus 46.6%. And the prevalence of psychotic illness, substance-related disorder, and self-harm were also substantially higher compared to all other groups in the Whittingham article. They also had substantially higher rates of psychiatric diagnosis, with health administrative data indicating that almost 4/5, 80%, had a psychiatric diagnosis, and almost half had a diagnosis of substance-related disorders. Over 1/3 had psychotic illness, and 12.8% had a prior self-harm diagnosis, also from the Whittingham article. The Matheson article found that among those incarcerated versus those without developmental disabilities were significantly more likely to have experienced a physician-diagnosed traumatic brain injury. They were more likely to be assaulted by others, have physical injuries, psychotic illness, and any non-psychotic psychiatric illness and substance use disorders prior to incarceration. So this might be a predictor for individuals in the community with developmental disabilities. If they are exhibiting multiple checks on this list, maybe we could provide better support so that they don't end up in the judiciary system. We also found across multiple articles that there were increased cases of hospitalization during and after incarceration, both for physical health and mental health or psychiatric reasons. This is an indicator that we need better transition programming and community supports for this demographic of our prison population. Individuals with developmental or intellectual disabilities had higher rates of health care use in prison compared to people without developmental disabilities, and higher rates of health care use post-release compared to people without developmental disability who were released from provincial prison, and compared to people in the general population with developmental disability and with no developmental disabilities. Whittingham and colleagues found a higher proportion of people in the prison group with developmental disabilities access any emergency department care at 63%, and over 50% of those were for life-threatening illnesses or situations. The proportion of people admitted to hospital in the year after prison release was also high for those in the prison group with developmental disabilities at 25.8% compared to all other groups, and with almost 1 in 5 people being admitted for psychiatric reasons and 1 in 10 people admitted for medical surgical reasons. All of this goes without saying that we need to have some solutions to help better support individuals with developmental disability before, during, and after incarceration in our Canadian context. And here are some ways that the authors have recommended moving forward to make a better situation for our individuals with developmental or intellectual disability. One way is by improving health and addressing social factors for people with developmental disability, by improving community mental health and physical health resources and support. It is clear that many individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities require assistance with educational and employment training opportunities to improve their reintegration potential moving back into their communities post incarceration. We should also be looking at diversion policies and court processes to more appropriate community-based programs which could prevent incarceration for this population, expanding the roles of diversion programs such as mental health court to include people with developmental disabilities who are charged with more serious crimes would allow them to remain in the community where they have a greater chance of accessing appropriate social and health support. Corrections staff training on working with and supporting individuals with developmental disabilities is another area of growth that our judicial systems could help in supporting individuals when they are incarcerated. Whittingham and Matheson both touch on this in their articles. Also, screening of newly incarcerated individuals would be necessary to be able to provide the appropriate supports that individuals need in the judiciary system and moving out into the communities after they've served their sentences. This is just the beginning of solutions and providing equitable access for these individuals to be able to be successful, happy contributing members of our communities and society. We as a country need to recognize that the overrepresentation of individuals with developmental and intellectual disability in our Canadian jails is not only a human rights issue, it's a disability rights issue, and that we need to change our government policy and support community programming to allow better access for individuals with intellectual and developmental disability to live meaningful and successful lives in our community without breaking the law and ending up in the judiciary system. Thank you for listening to my presentation today. I hope you enjoyed the information.